so we're going to go ahead and get started. So I'd like to introduce you guys. This is Eric Rucker. He is the director of the Simpson Youth Academy, which I was a part of when I was in high school. And he's here to talk to us a little bit about vocation. So I'll go ahead and have him kind of introduce himself, and then we can introduce ourselves too.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. I will tell a little bit more of my story in a minute when I kind of dive into everything. Can you hear me okay?
Great.
All right. So yeah, I can give more details of my story, but very briefly. I'm a campus minister at Simpson College, just south of Des Moines, Iowa. I've worked here for 5 years. And I work with college students, but also run that Youth Academy program that Alex mentioned for high school students during the summers. So I do a lot of work around faith, social justice, and vocational discernment. And I'm thrilled to be here. Yeah.
I'm Dave. I'm a campus minister here at the house. And I'm delighted to have you here. I just moved to a closer chair.
Perfect.
Chair.
I guess I can introduce myself too, but I'm Alex, and I'm a student at UNI.
Hi, I'm Jazz, and I am a student at UNI. Also, I live in the greenhouse.
Great.
Hello, my name is Robin. I am on staff here at Treehouse.
I'm Drew here at Treehouse. I'm Chef Drew. I make the soup for the soup chat. I'm also on the board here at Treehouse, and we've been doing the soup chats here for about a year and a half, maybe two.
Hey, I'm Rich. I went to UNI for a bit, didn't really work out, but I've sort of just stuck around at Treehouse ever since.
Hi, Eric, I'm Jane, and I'm the office manager here at Treehouse.
Great. Well, I can't see the room. Is that everybody? The whole room?
That's everybody.
Okay, great. Alex, do you want me to just kind of jump in now, or is there anything else we need to do?
You should be good.
Okay, wonderful. So my thought was I've got maybe 15, 20 minutes just to kind of share thoughts about vocation, my story. And then after that, I would love to have a little bit of conversation if folks have questions or just kind of want to respond. And if we have time at the end, I also have a little bit of kind of a practice that you could take with you, a reflective practice related to vocation. Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and dive in. I wanted to start by naming what I think vocation is not. Some of my experience working with, especially with college and high school students, is that either because of instructors or because of how the students hear things, there can be this particular ideal that everyone gets locked into, as if, oh, to do vocational discernment, I have to go to another country, or I have to like go on a solo hike by myself and meditate for like 20 days, in the wilderness and wait for God's voice to come out of the clouds, or I have to do like 57 internships to figure out what's going on. And one that's a problem because everybody, I think, does prayer and does discernment differently. But two, I think it's also a problem because it assumes everybody has the same amount of resources, and the same amount of opportunity. And so I want to name that sometimes these conversations can create shame, like, oh, I'm not good enough to do this, or anxiety of like, oh, I don't know the answer, or fear. And I know I don't have the power to take all that away, but I want to name from the beginning that's not my intention. And as somebody who's within the Christian tradition, I want to have us just kind of breathe, like exhale and breathe out, and remember that God is love. that's the ground of this conversation, is that your life is sacred and you have gifts, and your personhood is important, whether you have answers to any of these questions or not. So I want to begin there by saying vocational discernment is grounded in love. So to piggyback on that, say that again.
What a concept.
Yeah, I know. It seems obvious, but I've found it's important to name. The first thing I wanted to do, I'm going to throw a slide up here, is that, I've got kind of a few working definitions of vocation, but the first name is vocation as survival. And that kind of goes with what I was saying before, that sometimes we can talk about vocation in these abstract ways, or ways that it's like, oh, you have to have all these things set up perfectly to be able to do discernment. But I think sometimes that misses the kind of the foundational layer of vocation, which is that God calls us to live. And by that, I mean, I think at least when you look at the scriptures I work with within the Christian Bible, you think about, there's so many people just trying to make it. There are the Hebrews who are enslaved and they're trying to get out of a system that's hurting them. There are people who are wandering through the wilderness, very literally just trying to find the bread that they're going to eat for the day. In Jesus' day, there were all kinds of people with things that were happening to their bodies, that they were suffering and just trying to find relief for their bodies, and food and medicine. And so I want to name that before anything else, I think scripture says that God calls us to life. God calls us to live and to survive. And there's nothing unholy or shameful about maybe that's what we have to prioritize today, or in this season of our lives. And so that's part of vocation, is sometimes it's figuring out just like, how am I going to pay my bills? How am I going to eat? How am I going to take care of myself and those I love? Just the place we're at with mental health wise, especially for me this year, sometimes vocation is like, I woke up this morning, I got up, I made it through this day. And so basic practices of self-compassion, and getting what you need, that's the foundation of vocation, because God calls us to life. And there's nothing unholy about making it through a day, right? So I want to name that as an important foundation. But I want to build on that, because I even though we're called to life, I do think we're called to something more than that, if it's possible, at times in our life. So when we talk about vocation, that word vocation comes from the root of a word, vox. So vox means voice. And so, at least within the Christian tradition, when we say we're trying to discover vocation, that implies that there's a voice of God speaking through our own lives. And so if vox is voice, discernment is from the word diachrono, which means to sift through. So if we talk about doing vocational discernment, that means we have to sift through all the voices coming at us and all the choices to discern which ones we're going to choose, which of those voices we're going to listen to, who are telling us, who am I, how will I be, and what will I do. A way that I've found helpful to think about this is there's a lot of people who have talked about it. Thomas Merton is a writer, a monk and a writer from the 1960s who really lifted this up. But he uses this language that when we're kids, we grow up and we have to develop sort of habits or emotional processes to survive. He calls that the false self. And if you kind of imagine an onion, like the outside layer is the false self. It's the armor, right? We build to survive. It's the masks we wear for protection. The false self. And the true self, Merton and others, like that scripture says, our life is hidden in God. Our life is hidden with Christ in God. And I think that's the part of us, like the inside of the onion of ourselves. That's our true self, like the stuff beneath the armor, our whole self. If we were to just be loved, and the spontaneous response to that without censoring or filtering or hiding anything of our gifts, well, that's true self. in God, in the Christian tradition. And I think it's important to say we all have masks we wear, we all have armor we put on. That's not bad, that's not wrong. But I believe we're called to live not just on that surface level. You know, we all have to do that sometimes, but there's something beneath that's more deeply authentic to us, that's true self in the Christian tradition. And so I would say vocational discernment is finding safe places to take those masks off, and to ask, who am I really? You know, who did the divine create me to be in my fullness? I believe you had another speaker who might have referenced this. I think Alex mentioned, but one way I like to think of this is this question for true self. What is my deep joy? And where does it intersect with the world's deep need? Deep joy and deep pain. Where do those cross? Because that's where we're onto something about vocation. And I want us to think about this definition a little more carefully. It comes from a pastor named Frederick Buechner, articulated this. And he says, you know, it can't be just one or the other, right? Because there might be some things that give you life, but they're not meeting the world's deep needs. So like, if you want to be a lawyer that like handles litigation and protects like giant oil corporations, or if you want to start a loan shark company that takes advantage of poor folks, maybe that makes you feel good, but it's not meeting the pain in the world, right? Like, I don't think those careers are consonant with our Christian vocation, on one hand. But he says you have to be careful not to do the other one and swing the other way, because we might sometimes feel pressured to do things that might meet the world's deep need but aren't sustainable for us. So it's like maybe your parents or your mentor or somebody thinks like they put a lot of pressure on you that you should be a doctor or something like that, but maybe you just suck at science, you know, so that's probably not a good idea for you. Or maybe you can do it, but there's like no joy, you know, and you think you would burn out. And so that's not a gift that you can give to the world that's sustainable. So how do we bring these two together? Something that does meet my deep joy, and also I can confirm it leads to flourishing, you know, and justice and a goodness for my community. Some other things that kind of help me think about this. In the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, there's this vision of the law that says God is envisioning this community where there should be no poor among you. Like that's the vision, right? Is that we have enough that we can build a community where there are no people with want among us. And I think Jesus kind of lives into and builds upon that in his creation of beloved community, that he sits with everybody around the table. So if I was going to kind of bring that all together, I think for me, a vocational question is, how can I use my gifts, you know, my true self, to create that kind of community, a beloved community of justice? As I have had these conversations with adults, but also with young people, something I find a lot of times with the Youth Academy is that somehow folks got this idea that the only real callings are like religious callings, as in, the only people who are called are pastors, you know, or missionaries, or people who are paid by a church. And first we can unpack and kind of problematize that. But I think even more broadly, there's this misunderstanding that career is the same as vocation. You know, but whatever you get paid for, that's the scope and fullness of vocation. And so I want to say, that's not my understanding, and I don't think it's generally a correct interpretation of vocation within at least the Christian faith generally. I do think some people are called to work in churches, to be agents of religious reform, you know, to make the church and campus ministries better places, more just places that more reflect kind of Jesus' priorities. So yeah, maybe some of us are called to be working in churches at times, but there's so many other ways that you can live into vocation. When I think about business, like the area of business, we need people in business who treat their workers well, who create safe work environments, you know, who make sure that everyone is safe in those work communities. Something we don't talk about much is we need people to be philanthropists, right? So that the ministry I run, I don't get paid that much, but fortunately there's some people who are a little bit more wealthy who fund this ministry. And this ministry that is really important would not be possible if not for some folks who are making more money and generously giving so that this ministry is possible. So if you're in business or in the corporate sector and you make money, your responsibility, I believe, vocationally is to redistribute that wealth in ways that are going to profit those who are more vulnerable. Another way that this can work is in partnerships. If your partner is the breadwinner, one of the people in a partnership is a breadwinner, that might allow the other person in the partnership to do something as a career that they don't get paid as much for. So, for example, I get paid more than my wife, but I'm glad to do that because that enables her to do affordable housing work that we both really believe in. So it's not just an individualistic thing. Sometimes we take jobs that maybe aren't like equally fulfilling to us, either just to pay the bills or to let someone else do work maybe in our family or in our partnership that feels more vocational. So I could kind of go on and on, but I think we desperately need people living out their vocation in the arts. We need people in education who really care. We need scientists. We need so many people to be working on like renewable energy, for example, and so many other urgent needs within the field of science. We need people to run for office. So we so need people to run for office, for city council, for state senate, for Congress. Those decisions, we need people in those positions who are fighting for people to be able to vote, right? Or for fighting for against discrimination. So those are all essential spheres of society. So I think those are just sort of careers and the ways in which you could live out vocation in a variety of careers. But as I mentioned, I continue to learn that career is really just one very small puzzle piece in a life that we're called to live vocationally. So there are lots of questions. Like, I think, am I going to have a partner or not is a vocational question. And do I want to be a parent or not? And in what way? That's a vocational question. Where's the food that I eat come from? And what are my choices around food and the land? That's a vocational question. Where am I going to volunteer my time? That's a So I named that, and I could go on and on, but I just want to give a little window into those examples as a way in which every single facet of our life can be more or less aligned with, I believe, like the priorities of justice, compassion, and creativity. And I invite you to consider all those ways of living out vocation, not just a narrow one of what do I get paid for. So I want to kind of end with just a few little blips about my own story as a way to illustrate, I just gave that kind of abstract list, but hopefully to pull back the curtain and be like, here's the things I've struggled with and learned, and that maybe you can harvest some wisdom from. So just a couple minutes about like my own vocational journey. I was born in Kansas City, Missouri, and I grew up in the church, like in a local church. And my parents they weren't employed, but they were super involved in the church. And so that was really influential for me, mostly in good ways, but in a few ways that were harmful. I always had a lot of questions. Like I was asking early on the questions about like sexuality and science in the Bible and people who are homeless and on and on and on. So I just had a lot of those questions about how those interfaced with my Christian faith. So I went to college not knowing what I was going to do, but just like I knew that I was passionate about these questions about religion and society. And so I just sort of tried to follow that energy. So I went to college, I studied religion. During college, I got sick and I was hospitalized for a while. I'm type 1 diabetic. And so that happened to me my first year of college, and it was really confusing. And I was in the hospital, and I remember being really confused vocationally because it was sort of like, well, okay, I'm definitely going to have health insurance for the rest of my life. How am I going to pay for all these medications? How am I going to handle this chronic illness? Is this going to stop me from being the things I thought I was called to be? So that was that was a season of real confusion for me because of my health. As I got to the end of college, I think I had this pressure on myself that I had to be a community organizer or like be like Dorothy Day or Martin Luther King Jr. Like I had these images of who I had to be like. And that was well intentioned, but there was a lot of pressure there. So I applied for like 20 service corps programs that had community organizing components, and I applied for one grad school that was a seminary in Atlanta. And I told myself, if I get into this one grad school and then I get all these scholarships, then I'll go. But that's the only way. And lo and behold, all those doors just sort of opened up. And I remember a mentor saying to me, you know, a lot of people would probably struggle to say no to the scholarships and go do the service corps thing. And he said, but I think you're the opposite, that your ego, you know, you would like to do the kind of sexy social justice thing and kind of say, no, I'm not going to go be a traditional pastor. I'm not going to go to seminary. And he said, I think that the opposite would be harder for you. And maybe you'd have to dig into your stuff a little more if you go to seminary. And I was like, oh no, he's right. So I went to grad school in Atlanta, and I was there for 3 years, and I tried everything that I could. You know, it was just trial and error. I worked in a prison teaching theology. I worked at a church with a lot of folks with like different abilities who lived in group homes. And I really got into youth ministry there and working with high school students in residential programs. And I remember that energy. You know, I remember having conversations where I was like, to my friends, like, this is real, there's something about this that's like that, my gifts meeting this need in the world. And so I was kind of noting that for several years. At the end of seminary, I tried to get some more community organizing positions and didn't get them. And I remember being really confused and heartbroken with one. I got to like the final interview stage and I didn't get it. And I was like, I was just so fixated on this is the way it has to happen. And it wasn't happening in that way. I started dating my now wife. And we were discerning together. She wanted to come back to Iowa because her family's here. And Simpson College started this new program for high school students, and they were looking for a director. So I interviewed, and I got that job. But I think, you know, for 2.5 years between grad school and that job, I kind of had to wander in the wilderness a little bit. So I worked as a hospital chaplain for 2 years, 2.5 years, and it was okay. You know, it was like I was using like 60% of my gifts, but it felt like this isn't it. You know, like this isn't the thing I want to do for the rest of my life. So that's kind of an example. Like there'll be seasons where you're doing stuff that it's not the opposite of what you want to do, but maybe it's not a perfect fit. You know, so I had to spend some time in the middle there, just noticing what worked for me and what didn't work for me about that middle position. I also became a vegetarian during that time. And I want to name that because that's, again, part of the vocational process, thinking through what do I eat? How do I interact with the earth? That was it. That was a kind of a meaningful vocational transition for me. So I moved to Iowa. I got married. I got ordained in the Episcopal Church. My wife and I honestly have wrestled with and fought about what we want our family to look like and struggled because she's like, knows she wants kids. And I've never really felt that like strongly about it. We had a couple of miscarriages a year and a half ago, and that was really hard. And so I bring that up as another example that like if you experience like you think you have plans and you think God is calling you to something and it doesn't happen, you're not alone in that. You know, that happens to everyone, I think. And so that happened to me with family, that we had these miscarriages. And it's like, well, what does this mean? This isn't working in the way that we thought. So we were also at that time getting trained as foster parents. So for the last year and a half, we've been acting as foster parents for a couple of kids. And that's kind of an evolution of that vocation towards family building. So that's where I'm at, unfinished. I found a job that is energizing to me. I do work in the community and the church that's energizing to me. I'm a foster parent, which I feel ambivalent about. Like it's really hard. And sometimes I'm like, I don't want to do this. But other times I'm like, yeah, I can do this. So, yeah, so I'll kind of stop there. But I hope that sharing in my story just illustrated that definition of vocation as deep joy and deep need, but also the struggle and the ambiguity of figuring out how you work that out in your life. Yeah, so thank you so much for listening to me, and I'll just open it up. Oh, wait, I'm going to say one other thing. I'm just going to the final slide. So as I harvested all that, I wanted to just name like 4 things that I kind of noticed in my own story that might be helpful. I always think that seeking wise counsel, seeking mentors out is helpful. So I'd encourage you to take the initiative. We can't do it on our own, so seek out wise people who can help you listen to your life, because in every stage I had those people. So I'd say seek out wise counsel. I would say as much as you can, be at peace with trial and error, because that's the only way you're going to learn. That's the only way you're going to learn what resonates and doesn't resonate, and that's okay. That's part of the process. As I mentioned several times, listen for your energy, listen for your joy, and over time try to note that and follow it. And the last thing again is letting go of the anxiety and fear, and accepting this is a lifelong process, that every day we're discerning how we can be faithful again in new ways. So, all right, I'm going to stop now. So just welcome thoughts about, if you have questions, if you want to name things that either were most challenging for you or evocative for you, what was most important, I'll just kind of open it up.
Chef Drew.
Hello.
So, in telling your story, we have some similarities in it. I grew up in a religious household, but with big questions. And as I, through childhood and into adulthood, not questions that really question my faith, because my faith has always been strong. And so it wasn't so much a loss of faith, but it was being introduced to doctrines and dogmas and credos that sometimes with organized religion that seemed to conflict with what I felt was my inner conscience. The things that were telling me as a human being, related to other human beings, outside the scope of religion. So I just wondered, so you went and got ordained with the Episcopalian Church.
Yeah, that's right.
Did you ever have like an aha moment where this is the direction I want to go, and in the pursuit of like being called, that you were able to resolve some of the big questions in your own mind, and in working with your church or through your church, and that you came to understanding, or at least a comfortable place where you were able to find a church, a denomination, whatever, where those big questions didn't haunt you in such a way as you didn't want to become affiliated with any one particular organization or denomination.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. So a few things are coming to mind. One is that I can kind of respond specifically to that question, but lift it up for the whole group as a helpful framework is, in the Bible, we notice this pattern of, especially in the Psalms, of orientation, disorientation, and a reorientation. And I think we go through that throughout our lives, that like you said, you're given a certain orientation. Here's the box that God's in. Here's the institution. Here's what you have to believe. We go through experiences that make us challenge that. And it's like, I don't know if I agree with that. I don't know if I believe that. And I think we have to wrestle and be disoriented. But then hopefully by grace and with help of community, we reach a new orientation, a reorientation that isn't the same as being back at the old, but is a sort of a new expression of authenticity of, this is who I am. This is what I believe. Maybe it's more complex, maybe it's more mature, maybe it's more flexible. So I know vocationally, I've gone through lots of those series of orientation, disorientation, reorientation. for me, I needed to spend, I want to say 5-10 years out, kind of on the edges of the institutional church. Partially some of that I think was self-righteousness for me, of these folks don't have it figured out and I do. And that's something I had to kind of grow through. But I think part of it was love, you challenge things you love, you ask questions of things that you love. And I love the church. And so I asked questions of it. I have friends and colleagues who are in denominations that like the United Methodist Church, for example, that I think around LGBTQIA inclusion, some of them I think have discerned in their conscience, like I'm going to stay to be fighting on the inside. Others have decided because of my conscience, I'm going to leave, as an act of protest. And I empathize with both of those kinds of responses. I support the people who feel called to stay and reform. I support the people who feel called to leave and protest or start something new. I didn't feel like, for example, I didn't feel like being on the outside, I would actively join, in my 20s, an institution that I wasn't born into that I wanted to change. I felt more like I'm gonna kind of plant my flag in the ground somewhere that feels like it's just most aligned with where I'm at. And the Episcopal Church it's imperfect just like every other institution. But I think for me, I found a place where there's an acknowledgement of mystery. There's an acknowledgement we don't know everything. And also, I think the foundational thing that Jesus says is love God and love neighbor. That's everything else is secondary. And so for me, it's just the question, where can I find communities that are going to help me to love God and love neighbor the most fully? And I guess I landed in one of several places I could have that I feel like, given the limits of the human experience, this is a place that's going to try to help me do that.
You talked about realizing that you sort of liked the social justice stuff more than ordinary stuff, sort of thing. I guess I was wondering, there seemed to be like a story of like that surprising you and like maybe being upset about it, or like, I don't know. I feel like there was something to it that I maybe want to explore.
So I kind of heard that, but I heard you say, I don't know, Alex or something, could you get real close and just make sure I understand the question? I heard one to explore and the difference between justice and something.
They said that when you were talking about discerning between like community engagement and like social justice stuff versus going to seminary, that you were surprised that you felt like you were called to seminary, and that you might have been maybe disappointed or something like that, feeling something other than joy, I guess. And they wanted to know if you could elaborate more on that.
Sure. I mean, I think that something I'm learning, I think that part of spiritual maturity is moving from seeing everything as black and white, like it's all or nothing, to a sort of an ability to, we call it like dualistic versus non-dualistic. Dualistic is like, it's all or nothing. And non-dualistic is, I can acknowledge the complexity of this, that it's not all or nothing. And I think at that point in my life, when I was 21, I think that I was seeing things in a way that was pretty all or nothing. And that's not all bad. But I think it was sort of like, okay, this choice is going to define my life. That's a lot of pressure, first off. And second of all, there's this, I'm making this into a black and white, I'm imagining as a black and white decision where it's like, if I really care about social justice, I'll go do these programs. Or if I really care about like the institutional church, I'll go to seminary. Now, there are some seminaries and some churches where I do think it's a real black and white, because I think some churches kind of avoid talking about justice or actively work against it. So maybe that would have been true if I was like exploring a small amount of institutions. But based on my discernment, I don't think the all or nothing thinking that I had at that time was really accurate. There's a saying like God writes straight on crooked lines from the saints, and it's this idea that God works with our intention. It's a trusting that we can cooperate with the grace of God, and that together somehow we'll kind of stumble into piecing together what makes sense, even if we're going to take some detours. So I actually believe, even though I'm glad I went to seminary, I don't think that was an all or nothing. I think I could have gone and done like service corps for 2 years. There would have been some things that resonated with me, but I probably still would have had that nagging feeling of like, I think there's still something to explore, at seminary. And in the same way, like when I went to seminary, that was just the next step. But getting there, that didn't fulfill, like, it wasn't like I'm totally fulfilled, now I'm finished. It was just a step. And then I was able to see, okay, there are 100 different ways I could use this degree. Which of these directions am I going to go in? And so I think either way I chose, ultimately I could have built the other thing into it. I could have built theological education and after my service corps stuff. Or when I went to seminary, I built in the social justice stuff into that experience. So I wonder if it's less, do I make the right or wrong decision? And more like, how do you do the very decisions that you make? What's the posture? Because if we can step forward with a posture that's non-dual, that allows for mystery, that allows for complexity, that is patient with the process, I think like cooperating with God, we can integrate into a lot of our choices the things that we're called to, as long as we're not thinking all or nothing about it.
I'm wondering what has your kind of career path as far as like youth ministry and going to seminary, what has that taught you about yourself?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say I think it's brought me more clarity about maybe the things I am and things that I'm not. I just talked about not being all or nothing, so that sounds like a little bit of a dualistic statement. But I think I don't think that everybody is called to work with like high school and college students, and that's okay. And I think that's kind of part of the maturing too, is like sometimes there can be I think for me it's like in my 20s there could be a self-righteousness about I know like the most important work and that's what I have to do, and then there's a sort of judgment of other people's vocations. But I think as I've grown more comfortable with what I am, which is like, yeah, I'm good at this. I'm good at working with high school and college students. I like sitting in that liminal place of transition with folks and traveling in that part of their journey. And so I've learned that about myself. And that's also told me more about what I don't want to do. I know that I tried being a hospital chaplain and it was okay, but I know that that's not what I want to do for the rest of my life. Like I kind of picture as these different components, it's like putting the puzzle together. And in the same way, like the service corps thing, that would have been one piece of the puzzle, but I think that would have been like 30% of what I cared about. And it would have been missing like the religious education piece and the working with young people piece. So I do think it's sort of like, how do I build this all together? So like what I'm learning is like, I think I'm at my best when I get to do some teaching, when I get to do some like one-on-one meetings, like relationship building, when I get to do some preaching, when I get to do some fundraising and organizing. But if I was just doing one of any of those full time, I would kind of feel like I'd be missing the others, you know? And in the same way, I think it's kind of vocationally, like, it's not just a career. Like, as I've done that, like, I thought about doing like a music education major in college because I really love music. But I just sort of discerned that that doesn't feel like my thing I'm going to get paid for. But I would be I'd be depressed if I didn't get to do any music in my life, you know? So I have to figure out different ways to do that because I don't get paid for that. So I play music in my church and I write music and share it with my friends. And so it's been like, what am I going to get paid for, and how do I build that in a way that fits for me? But also, how do I not neglect all these other gifts I feel like God is calling me to cultivate outside of my job too?
Where am I? There we go.
Hello.
The camera is not in the TV.
I can hear you.
What kind of advice do you give to people who are finishing college and have not any clear sense of what's next than when they first started? What's your experience? How would you go about that?
Yeah. This could sound like bad news, but I think it's good news. Like, I think you should expect your 20s to be confusing. Maybe that's too much of a blanket statement, but I think I had somehow from movies or something, I had this idea of like, you finish college and then it all pays off, you know, in the first year. That wasn't my experience in my 20s. Like, my 20s was really confusing. And there were detours, there were dead ends, there was pain, there was confusion, there was loss. And so you could take that as bad news of like, oh, this is going to be a terrible next 10 years for me. Or you could accept it as like, oh, there's not some, you know, that means there's not something wrong with me when I experience that, because I think it's a very human part of our experience in our society is the wandering and the exploring. I know it's a little bit, it's so much easier to say than to do, but I would invite you into as much playfulness and curiosity as you can cultivate, even though I know it's scary. What does it mean to try to be curious? What does it mean to keep gaining wisdom and knowledge about yourself, even if you're not doing the thing you're going to do for the rest of your life? I was thinking the other day, I was like, you know what? Like, Jesus wasn't even famous for his actual career. Like, he was a carpenter. Like, he didn't get paid to do the thing that was most important to him at all, right? Like, he was building chairs for the first 30 years of his life. And what if he wouldn't have had that time? You know, I'm guessing he decided to use that time in a way. It's like, I'm going to observe myself. I'm going to observe the human experience. I'm going to grow as much as I can during that time. And so, well, what does it mean that Jesus, like, he didn't get paid for the thing he did most? And I'm really glad he did the things that he did outside of his job, right? So just encourage that kind of curiosity that's truly, you never know what's going to come, you know, of the next season of your life.
I think that is really wise, because I went from college to seminary to pastoring without wandering I've always been curious. That's some of my Enneagram 7s. But I wish that I had done, I think now, I wish I had done gap year things. I wish I had wandered a little bit more. I wandered to Iowa from Ohio and then stayed. But I think I was thinking the other was pastoring a congregation at 25, where most of the people were twice my age. Jamie and I were both doing that. And it's like, what business did we have doing that? It would have been good. And I didn't question it. It was just sort of like, okay, this is how it was a little too easy, I think. But then I got in campus ministry and I've been wandering curious for 25 years. So I guess I've had my wilderness at the end of my career rather than at the beginning.
Yeah, sure. Well, I want to be sensitive to this group's time. Alex, would you be okay if we ended with a couple minutes of this reflective practice that you can take with you? Is that all right?
Yeah.
Cool. So I want to end with this. You might be familiar with it already, but it's a practice called the prayer of examination. And what you do is it's a prayer where we work with our memory to notice these questions of energy. Really with the idea that, I think sometimes we say, I don't know what God's saying to me, or I don't know what I should do with my life. And I think if we're honest, we really haven't disciplined or created a rhythm in our life where we're really listening that closely sometimes. And so part of what I think the Christian tradition invites us to is to structure our lives in ways that instead of expecting we're going to do it all in one big dollop in one day, magically understand ourselves. But if we built in little bite-sized pieces of that each day to reflect in a very simple way. So this is just a practice called the prayer of examination. It's been around the Christian tradition for, I want to say, hundreds and hundreds of years. I'm just going to put it on the screen, and I'm going to take us through it in 3 or 4 minutes, but you can take it with you. So it goes like this. So the first thing you do, which I'm going to invite you to do, is just take a couple deep breaths. Slow down. And I want you to simply review the last 24 hours of your day in your head. Think about what has happened. That can be very small things or bigger things. Just take 1 minute to think what's happened in the last 24 hours. And if you find your mind wandering, just take a breath and come back to reviewing what's been going on. And as you do that, the first of 2 invitations is this. With God, I want you to notice what we call the desolation. So these are moments where you felt far from God, you felt disconnected from yourself, you felt irritated, angry, scared. Are there any moments of desolation? You simply notice them. You don't have to react to them. Just note them in the last 24 hours. And then I invite you to set those desolations aside and now note any consolations. Consolations just means the opposite. When did you feel like your true self? When did you feel connected to God or to the divine? When do you feel like you were participating in something that was life-giving for you or the world? And then the last thing we do is we gather that all together and we call it looking forward with hope. So maybe form a prayer, even if it's a very small prayer in your heart, either wrestling with the desolation, asking for God to help you in that desolation, or in the consolation, that this is a way that we take what we've noticed and then we ask God for what we need based on what we've noticed. So let's just take 30 seconds to do that. So I invite you to listen to this closing prayer. I'm going to read. It's on the screen too. It's called Trust the Slow Work of God. Above all, trust in the slow work of God. We're quite naturally impatient in everything to reach the end without delay. We should like to skip the intermediate stages. We're impatient of being on the way to something unknown, something new. And yet it's the law of all progress. And progress is made by passing through some stages of instability, and that may take a very long time. And so I think it is with you. Your ideas mature gradually. Let them grow. Let them shape themselves without undue haste. Don't try to force them on as though you could be today what time, that is to say, grace and circumstances acting on your goodwill, will make of you tomorrow. Only God could say what this new spirit gradually forming in you will be. Give our Lord the benefit of believing that God's hand is leading you, and accept the anxiety of feeling yourself in suspense and incomplete. Amen. So friends, that's just a little practice that you can do. The monks who used to live in the monasteries, they would do that every evening. So what would it look like to turn off your phone for 5 minutes, at the end of the day, and just journal that? What was hard for me? What was life-giving for me? And slowly you accumulate over day, maybe an emerging sense of what you care about, what you're about, what's beautiful in the world to you. That's just one practice you can take with you.
Thank you so much for joining us, Eric. I was really glad that you were able to.
Yeah, thank you for your thoughts and your questions. But it's great to hear some response, and love what you all are doing in the community you have there. So it's a privilege to be involved.
Would you be able to share the slideshow with us?
Definitely, yeah. I can email it to you all. Yeah, absolutely.
Next week, at the same time, next Tuesday at noon, we're going to have Bishop Laurie from the United Methodist Church with us. She's going to lead a discussion for us.
Be watching this. My goal is to jump off from what you've done.
Cool.
So Bishop Laurie is your backup.
Oh my. Okay. Well, I hope I've laid a little bit of groundwork, but I'm sure she'll have some great stuff to contribute.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you all.
Thank you.